Good afternoon, all. I warmly welcome everyone for today's incubation organized by AAAD Bangalore. This is Ashwini Patil. I am the moderator for today's session. Before we begin the session formally, we would like to play a short video. Over to you, Siddharth sir. Before we start the session, I have a couple of announcements to be made. To have an uninterrupted session, I would request all the delegates and the participants to kindly switch off their video and mute their audio. All the participants are requested to post their questions related to the topic in the chat box, which will be answered at the end of the session. The key to understanding future is one word: sustainability. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Professor Monto Mani sir. Monto's research deals with sustainability science and interdisciplinary domain, focusing both on its theoretical basis and application in architecture, buildings, and design. His Sustainability and Design Lab, SUDESI, comprises multidisciplinary researchers working on diverse areas of sustainability, dealing with buildings, renewables, product design, and manufacturing. He is an architect with a master's degree in civil engineering and a doctoral specialization in sustainability, where he developed a systems framework identifying societal attitude as a critical determinant of sustainability. So without any further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our speaker, Professor Monto Mani, sir. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be there, and I'll share my screen.
Yes, sir.
Is it visible now?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Yeah. So this is dealing, I work in the area of sustainability, looking at buildings and design. And these are the past 14, 15 years of my experience of challenges that we have encountered. The fact is that we spend a lot of time in buildings, nearly 70-80%, and with the COVID situation, it was nearly 99% that we were indoors. And the fact that all this webinar and operating through Teams, all that is facilitated by the fact that we have our indoor environment configured to provide us comfort and the productivity related support. So buildings come in various forms. So like the building on the left you see is a street in Seoul, and you will see a double facade building as well as a glazed building. The building on the top mid you will see is a traditional building. I'm sure many of us would have seen it traveling around rural areas in India. And this is a building in West Bengal. The building right below that is our photovoltaic lab, which which we set up in way back in 2006. So that is the photovoltaic roof, and our entire lab is below. And the right hand side is again a building with absolutely no openable windows, with the completely conditioned indoors. Now, all of these has completely been challenged given the COVID situation, where even ASHRAE is now recommending 100% fresh air intake, simply due to the fact that recirculating air, which was conventionally done in air-conditioned buildings, is unsafe due to the spread of virus, right? And also the fact that earlier apartments used to only talk of bedroom, number of bedrooms, number of living rooms, or living room and kitchen. Given that today nearly significant share of the workforce is operating from home, other than delivery people, other than the hardcore manufacturing industries, IT industry, nearly 95% of them are working from home. So it might even actually cause us to relook at the apartment itself as to whether a small work office or an office space will be part of an apartment in the future, right? Children's study, children's area was another thing. And also the fact that kids are also at home, parents have to manage the kids, the cooking, their office, their professional work. So the indoor environment definitely has a strong influence on our operation and productivity. Now coming to the fact that with the COVID, the environment has also recovered very, very fast. In fact, we've been able to achieve a significant share of the Paris Agreement, in terms of emissions control and all, without doing anything at all in the last 4 or 5 months, right? So if we have to relook at the post-COVID situation and see what is the new normal, definitely people's concern towards the environment is far greater now. And at the same time, the sensitivity of our impact on the environment will also get greater scrutiny, right? So this is a good data from a book called the Zero Energy Development Book, where they looked at ecological footprint versus satisfaction with life. At one point in time, satisfaction with life or lifestyle was measured in terms of our income, GDP, right? How much cement are we consuming? If you look at industry growth, it was measured in terms of cement consumption or cement being manufactured. Today, all of us know the green building rating system actually appreciates us using no cement at all or using very little cement, right? So ecological footprint is the land mass required to support the lifestyle that we have. So if I'm wearing a cotton shirt, it is growing somewhere, it is getting processed somewhere, it is getting dyed somewhere. So if I start looking at the land area that is required to support the products that are in my lifestyle, my energy requirement comes from, say, photovoltaic plants, which is say put in some desert somewhere. So its unit is global hectares per capita. Now this book looked at satisfaction with life with a different metrics. They looked at, am I happy doing the job that I am involved in? Do I have time with my friends? Do I have time with my family? Am I contented? It was a different metrics as compared to looking at GDP, my income level. And here you will see there is no correlation between satisfaction with life and ecological footprint. You have United States and Canada with very high ecological footprint and very high satisfaction with life, as against you have very poor countries like Ghana, which also have a very high satisfaction with life with very low ecological footprint, right? And this brings us to the distinction between Western philosophy of life and Eastern philosophy of life. The Western philosophy says, go after your desires, satisfy your desires, and you're happy. But our desires are not limited. They always keep increasing, right? The Eastern philosophy says, have no desires and you're happy, right? Now, the thing is that we follow both. We follow the Western philosophy, Western ideology till retirement. And post-retirement, we follow the Eastern philosophy. Now we say society is important, family is important. I want to devote more time towards the environment. I want to do more for the society, you know. So these are some personal dilemmas that come when we are looking at sustainability. Another aspect which we need to look at is the economy that we are right now dependent upon is driven by consumerism, which means that what I was consuming yesterday is less than what I have to consume today, right? And I will touch upon the topic later. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, can we talk of sustainability if our economy is driven by consumerism, right? And each one of us evaluates our own lifestyle. We know that what we were consuming 10 years back and what we are consuming today is way more, right? And it can also be witnessed in terms of the waste that gets generated from our own households every day. The plastic waste, the packaging waste, right? So again, I was coming down to this fact that income level and happiness are two not really correlated parameters. So while income levels have been rising from the 1950s, from the industrialization time, the happiness levels have actually been going down. And we all know that people in the city are less happy. Even going to the job and coming back home in the traffic is not really a very pleasurable or a relaxing experience, right? And that has also been challenged now with the COVID situation, where do we need to travel 2 hours to our offices when we can work from home? Whereby those 2 hours I get additional to spend at home, I can utilize it towards something else, towards my children. And at the same time, not carry the stress to office attributed to the traffic that I'm facing, right? So across the world, there is now a relook at reconfiguring the concept of work itself. Now I will also come down to distinguishing between energy zero and zero energy. The house on the left is a house in rural villages, and that house, when we were starting to study it way back in 2004, did not have electricity supply at all. Right, and electricity supply is the modern face of the energy. Now the question here is, do we call that house as zero energy because they don't utilize energy the way we do? Or on the lab, my lab on the right hand side, where we are trying to generate as much energy as we consume, and we call it energy zero, right? And then I get points for my green rating system and all of that. So if you see, both the houses are not the same, though we might assume that both are zero energy, right? And this is where we have another challenge in terms of our energy footprint, life cycle energy footprint in dwellings. If you look at operational energy on the right-hand side, the right-hand side bottom is a vernacular dwelling, where operational energy, that is the energy required to keep your houses safe, well lit and comfortable. Like right now, we're probably sitting in each of our houses with a computer running, light on, or maybe in an air-conditioned office, right? So those all will contribute to operational energy. Embodied energy is the other factor that is important. Is the energy going into the manufacture and transport and commissioning of the materials that we use in buildings, right? So if you look at traditional buildings, embodied energy is less than 2 gigajoules per meter square, and operational energy is less than 1 gigajoules per household per year. For a city dwelling, that operational energy goes from 1 to 15, and embodied energy goes from 2 to 4. Whereas for a modern dwelling, the operational energy goes from 1 to 42, and embodied energy goes from 2 to 8. So can you imagine that with India and China having about 1.8 billion rural population, if their lifestyle energy is going to multiply by 42 times, where do we have the energy and resources? It might be good for the economy, but can the economy sustain with the biodiversity and the resources being completely exhausted? So that is also another challenge that we have as to how do we address their aspirations for a modern house without impacting the environment as much. And these are realities that are facing us. Like, for example, in the same village, we see transitions, modern transitions. The roofs change, then the wall changes. And all these transitions actually happens when somebody from the village goes to the city, earns a little more and comes back and he says, no, we shouldn't live like this again. We should live a modern life. And what happens is that as these transitions happen, the houses are no longer as comfortable as they were before. So in fact, after the tin roof, what happens is that in the afternoon when they actually want to sleep, they go to the tree, under the tree outside and sleep, right? So when houses are not comfortable anymore, you need to have fans, then you need to have electricity, and then your energy consumption starts to go up. This is happening in China as well. If you look at traditional constructions and modern constructions both side by side, you will see that these modern transitions are very much evident. So what we had done is in 2012, we had estimated the impact of these transitions on the global carbon dioxide emissions. And we found that the original transition that happens is change in the building material. The geometry, form, orientation of the dwelling remains the same. So just that transition alone causes a minimum of 6 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. And because of which it will actually increase the global carbon dioxide emissions anywhere from 5 to 20-25%, right? The basic baseline level. If we look at modern, they adopting modern houses, going for air conditioning and all, that will actually multiply and worsen even further, right? And government is yet to actually accommodate these sort of projections for realistic estimates of our own carbon emissions or carbon footprint. This is an estimation of the operational energy requirement, and this is again the baseline where I have based this data on purchasing power, income levels, accessibility of goods, proximity of the villages to and parameters like that. And here one aspect which is important to note is that the aspect of rebound effect. What rebound effect states is that with our lifestyles becoming increasingly efficient, our net energy consumption actually goes up. And the good example is a television. At one time, we used to have one television for a village. It was the old CRT based television, so which we will call very energy guzzling today. But one entire village used to look at Doordarshan maybe 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. Everyone used to see only one channel, maybe discuss on it. So the community was rather unified there in terms of what they were seeing, what they were discussing, even if it's a cricket match. Today, you see, we have LED TVs, very, very affordable, and channels which can, maybe about a few hundred channels, which anyone can see 24/7. Which means that each one of us has a different preference to a channel. Children want cartoons, maybe the adults would like to see games or TV or some movie. And the senior people want to see some religious channel or something to do with gardening or something like that. So we have 3 televisions in the house, and all of us, to prevent noise interfering from one TV to the other, prefer to look at locked rooms, which means that within the family there's fragmentation in terms of interactions, right? Each one is stuck to his television, and if you look at the net energy consumption is actually higher because we have 3 televisions now instead of 1, right? So this rebound effect, in fact, if you look up literature, is even in Europe it is to the order of 300%, 500%. And so the idea of adopting energy efficient devices with the intention of reducing energy consumption is not happening. It is actually reverse. And with appliances becoming more and more efficient, their affordability goes up, people buy more of them. And another example which each one of us knows is our mobile phones, right? Earlier we had a single, then we went in for a second mobile. After the dual SIM mobiles came, now we have a spare mobile. We have a laptop, right? In addition to the televisions at home, we have a tablet which we give our children. So if you look at our energy footprint, is actually increasing, though our laptop is more efficient than the laptops that were there 10 years back. Another aspect that we looked at is climate change. And this is again a recent study that we showed, it's an ongoing work in terms of how do we look at resilience of dwellings to withstand climate change. So one way we can look at climate change is places are going to get warmer or wetter, in which case we look at a shift in the climate zone that the buildings belong to. So take Suganhalli, which is warm, humid, about 90 kilometers from Bangalore, a rural dwelling. If it were to become hot, dry, or if it were to become temperate, then what happens to the performance of the building? And many of us would be familiar with this concept of adaptive comfort, where the physiological ability of the human body to withstand external temperature variations is reflected in terms of our thermal comfort requirements. So we feel comfortable at a higher temperature in summer and comfortable at a lower temperature in winter, naturally. And then we have other adaptive measures like wearing a little lighter clothes or wearing an additional sweater, or deciding to open our windows. So those are those adaptive features or adaptive approaches or strategies that we can take. So here we look at thermal comfort represented in these bands with respect to external climatic conditions. And what we found is that if you look at vernacular dwellings and conventional dwellings, the conventional dwellings are actually showing a greater discomfort in terms of increasing warmth or sensation of warmth as compared to vernacular dwellings. And with climate change, we will find that conventional dwellings are going to feel even more uncomfortable than vernacular dwellings. And the same for temperate. And unfortunately, what happens is that vernacular dwellings are those we call undeveloped, or we need to change or modernize them. And we have 60–65% of India's population still living in rural dwellings, which reveal a far greater resilience to climate change than modern dwellings, right? Which means that these dwellings will be able to perform well under climate change without the need for any intervention. In fact, this paper won the Best Students Paper Award at the Comfort at the Extreme conference, where a lot of the stalwarts in thermal comfort and building performance were there. Now coming to BIPV lab, people think that photovoltaics are the way forward. Photovoltaics are green and clean and perceptions like that. So what happens is that when we look at the performance of photovoltaics integrated in buildings, it is not easy, because when we design a building, we try to design a building to minimize the solar exposure so that the heat gain can be reduced. But when you want to install photovoltaics on the building, you have to maximize the solar exposure, because the output of the PV system will only then be high. But then we have other factors like dust influencing or dust impact on the photovoltaic panel that depends on the geometry of the building. So we looked at all of these parameters, and we found that it's not really that sustainable to integrate large scale photovoltaic systems, right? The problem is dust. Here you can see microscopic images of how dust influences photovoltaic performance. And what happens is, to clear the dust, we use water, and we use about half a liter of water every meter square of the panel area every day. And this is true for all megawatt scale power plants where they have now robots or automated systems to clean. They are coming up with measures to lower the water usage, but we have to understand that this is not recycled water, or this is not seawater that is used for cleaning photovoltaic panels. It's clean water. And I'm aware of a few megawatt scale level power plants which are buying mineral water because the groundwater is very saline to clean photovoltaic panels, right? Now the question is that we are utilizing so much water to clean photovoltaic panels when drinking water is a scarcity in many places, right? So we actually came up with these are some curves telling you the current and the voltage coming out of the photovoltaic panel when it is dirty. So the blue line that you see is when there is a lot of dust on the panel, and once we clean it, the current actually increases. And what happened here is that we came up with the traditional palm leaf based brooms which can clean photovoltaic panels without the need for water. And we also actually tested, verified how they are cleaning it under the scanning electron microscope. We found the edges are very hard, so they can actually even remove bird droppings from the photovoltaic surfaces. So we were able to bring down the water consumption from half a liter to less than 50 ml of water per day per meter square. The other aspect with the photovoltaic panels, and you will realize it in the next 1 or 2 years, is that what do we do with the photovoltaic panels that are discarded? And now the government is coming up with a commission for photovoltaic waste. And please mind you that photovoltaic waste, when sent to the landfill, is extremely toxic. There is a lot of tin, lead, chromium that leaches to the ground. And India is likely to generate a few 100,000 tons of photovoltaic waste every year, starting from 2030. The world over, how do we handle photovoltaic waste is a serious concern now. And if you Google it, you will realize what I'm referring to. Now, with smart buildings, there is also this notion that with connected buildings, IoT, today computer science people are actually saying that I can monitor the location of a person in a building based on his mobile phone. Because your network, your Wi-Fi can tell which part of the building you are in, which means that according to your preferences, your air conditioning temperature can be set, lights can be switched on, computers can be switched on based on where you're moving about in the building, right? The issue of privacy is another aspect which falls in the domain of ethics that I will not cover now. But the work that we're trying to do here is, if we are going to put sensors in buildings to save energy, then what happens as we go further? So we took the example of a motion sensor to connect to a LED light. And we brought in this concept of energy neutrality, which means that if we look at the life cycle energy of a sensor and look at the energy it is saving, in the case of LED lights, what we found is that the energy saved is actually less than the energy going into the manufacture and install of the sensor itself. So we are trying to come up with some design guidelines so that there will be clarity on where it makes sense to connect sensors and where it does not. So we took the example, like I said, of a motion sensor which was manufactured in Shanghai, and we actually opened up the sensor, looked at the various electronic components inside, tried to see where they are sourced from, looked at their transport energy, installation, and all of that. And finally, we accounted for shipping and the Amazon delivery guy, the packaging material, the bubble wrap, everything we accounted for. And what we found is that we came up with this notion of gram per wattage ratio, where it is the grams of the motion sensor or the sensor network itself to the wattage of the load connected to it. And what we find is that with appliances being very inefficient, like incandescent bulb is very inefficient. It's operating at 10 lumens per watt, right? Or less than that. The rest of it getting wasted as heat. The potential for us to save energy is much higher when we are depending on inefficient devices. But today our appliances are also becoming very efficient, right? LED lamps, for example, they are very super efficient. So our potential to save energy actually goes down. So does it really make sense to additionally put a sensor there to switch on and switch off based on the need to save energy? And not only that, what we realize here is that with dependence on sensors, there are behavioral changes happening in us. For example, when I go to my office, I walk into my office, my light goes on. I leave the office within about 15 minutes, the light goes off. And then when I come home, I find that the light does not switch on when I walk in. So I switch it on physically. But then when I leave the room, subconsciously, I keep thinking that the light will switch off. So the whole night the light is on. So at the end of the day, because of my behavioral changes, there is a energy wastage happening at some other place where there is no smart sensory setup there. And also this issue of a sedentary life with a very, with the need to go get up and switch on, switch off. There is a mental connect we have with the environment. People call it, what do you call that? Living in the moment. All of those concepts we are losing track of, where we are not in the present moment, where our sensitivity to, oh, light is there, fan is switched on, when I leave, I switch it off. So it creates a different sort of a problem, which we are not yet faced to. We are not faced for. Today, none of us can think of a world or waking up without a mobile phone next to us, right? We are far more insecure than we were when we had the mobile phone, right? So from a sustainability point of view, where are we heading? Those are some challenges we need to really investigate. So this is again some data from the motion sensor that I spoke of, where the transport energy turns out to be significant, and making the sensor in India and installing it, and making the sensor in China, transporting it, installing it, has a far greater influence on the life cycle energy of the building, just by looking at these parameters. In fact, the student who is doing his PhD on this also went to University of Florida to extend this concept further, test it further, and see, can we come up with some design guidelines? And there are some other geometric configurations also. For example, if we design a building, we design the building and then later look at, oh, how do I put the sensors? Will the sensor cover every nook and corner of my room? So the geometry of operation of a sensor and the geometry of room in terms of our usage are also need to be optimized to each other, right? So we might find that the shape of the room or the size of the room will again get fine-tuned based on minimizing the sensors that would be required to install in that room. Again, the last part, I will just bring up the fact that we have many different lightings, right? We have seen incandescent bulb, we've seen CFLs, and we've seen LEDs. Blindly, all of us go for LEDs with the notion that, yes, it is good for the energy, it is good for the environment. Because it is using less energy, it is good for the environment. But we fail to see that blind dependence on energy efficient devices could pose other problems. And this is what we realized that, and this was actually, I was exposed to this by a professor from Germany. She was from the Coburg School of Arts and Architecture, and she was into interior design, right? And she said, Monto, when you work under constant LED light, you are more short-tempered, very impulsive, hyperactive, and have other problems of sleep. Now, mobile phones have the sleep mode where the white screen actually changes to a warmer screen so that it does not upset our sleep cycle. Now that white light, cool white light that you get from the LED is actually induces hormonal changes in the body, causing you to be hyperactive. Now you can be for 20 minutes of the day. That your body can take only that much stress. You can't be hyperactive 6 hours, 8 hours of the day. Hyper attentive, right? So when we looked at different lights, we found that the yellow line that you see here is a natural light that comes indoors. The light coming from a filament bulb is the next closer that you get. But the LED lamp that you get has this blue peak here, which our eyes are not really exposed to. As in, our eyes are not used to taking this volume of blue light coming indoors, right? So what we did was that, and this was causing a lot of problems. If you look at literature on ophthalmology, this light actually causes permanent retinal cell deaths, right? And so much so that when we put LED lamps in my lab and we put LED street lights in the institute, we found that the street lights were causing a lot of glare, a lot of eye pain related problems. Nocturnal wildlife disturbances were noticed. So we tested various filters and we found that there's a polyamide film by name Kapton, which is available on Amazon, which actually filters off this light. And the brown shade that you see is after application of this filter. Now there is some limitation in terms of the color rendering index, whereby blue tends to be a little greenish and those challenges, but that can be observed, that can be addressed later. Primarily, we are cutting off the light, the part of the spectra which is damaging to the eye and rendering the LED light safe. So in fact, we published this information so that people can access it. It got published in Down to Earth, and so that people can use this. A lot of industries have adopted it. A lot of people have actually written to us asking, how do I, I'm having eye inflammation problem because of LED lights, and what do I do about it? So when we look at sustainability, we have to understand that just low energy is not the only parameter, or minimum pollution is not the minimum parameter. We have to go beyond efficiency and look at effectiveness. And the LED lamp is a good example where LEDs are efficient, but are they an effective, safe light for us to depend on? Unfortunately, there is no other way. Industry is trying to come up with various lighting solutions. Even monitors today, they are saying low E monitors, low blue light monitors, blue filter monitors, because the industry is also aware of the health implications because of these exposed to these radiations. And finally, I will conclude with this slide as to whether energy efficiency is enough. What about building materials, where we are increasingly adopting exotic materials coming from different parts of the world, which are manufactured in the name of green buildings? Again, codes connected with unconventional buildings, unconventional, buildings as in vernacular dwellings, and integration of renewables and dependence on photovoltaics is also a big challenge today. So I can also tell you that there are increasing concerns about using windmills, wind turbines for generating electricity. And there is actually a paper published at IISc in Nature, where they found that windmills actually displace top predatory birds, the raptors. So much so that the population of the ground-based, chameleons and lizards is having evolutionary changes in them, right? So no one would have understood, would have linked that putting windmills will change because evolutionary changes among reptiles, right? So moving forward, the ideology on sustainability is how less can I consume rather than how much more can I consume and how do I find alternative or renewable energy sources to support my increasingly energy dependent lifestyle. So I will stop with that. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So we are heading the session for question and answer. I request participants to post their questions in the chat box. So we have one question here. Is it possible to develop sustainable environment-friendly construction with the concept of smart city, green building and social and housing policy?
I think architects also have the challenge that clients should be willing to cooperate, right? And unfortunately, we are increasingly so insecure now that we want our houses very close to hospitals. You know, the land prices are much higher if your apartment is close to a hospital. So the notion of what is environment friendly itself is flawed. Right. We say that using earthen materials or earth-based materials is safe. But then if the moment we say that build with earth, passive thermal comfort, we need thicker walls, we say, oh, we are losing carpet area, let the walls be as thin as possible. So we are trying to match greed with guilt, where we want everything, best of everything, at the same time environment should also be there, right? Yes. Even if you look at our bylaws says that FSI, have so much greenery. That is very difficult because the client will say, oh, why should I have so much area open to greenery? So we want to be green without being green or without leaving room for greenery. So I think it is unfortunately a balance between our greed and guilt. What I meant is that we feel guilty for what we're doing. At the same time, we want to have everything. So that I think will be, which even in our religious scriptures is not possible,
Yes.
Where, so it's difficult. But operationally, the challenge is that can we first see, this is a question which I was posed, and in fact one of my mentors gave me the answer is to where do I start? The start is first within our own lifestyle. Can we use that and set that as an example rather than we tell somebody else to live a green and clean life? And I know the clean and green life is there in villages where there was no concept of waste, and we call that undeveloped. And if you want to have a village-like life in the city, you have to pay 4 crores, 5 crores for a villa, which is out of reach of majority of the population. Right, so you have both extremes. You have the super rich who live a sustainable life, and you have the really poor people who live a sustainable life, and whose sustenance itself is threatened now.
Yes. That's it, sir. We had one question.
Okay. So I can sign off then. I'm really happy and thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you, sir. Sir, now I invite Architect Arunachal Ombali, sir, for a concluding address.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Montomani, sir, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I know you from a long time, and it was a actually very simple exercise to make our students understand what is sustainability. We always talk about buildings and all that. So I was very happy, you mentioned about Western lifestyle, Eastern lifestyle, clothing. I mean, it was very nice. I mean, you just mentioned about the geometry of rooms and how sensors are related to the geometry of rooms. I mean, it was very simply understood. You literally covered the wide spectrum of sustainability, a way of life. I think it was very good, Monto sir.
Thank you.
I'm very sure our students are benefited, and I would also take the liberty to I'm sorry, kind of tell you that once the situation becomes normal, we would like to bring our students to the institute.
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy.
I've seen the labs and all that. They're very interactive, and I think our students can learn much more about sustainability and all the parameters of sustainability.
Right.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. From AAAD, again, I would like to thank you for sparing your time, joining us, and giving your valued inputs.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
It's an honor to present a vote of thanks in the presence of such esteemed guests. Thank you, Professor Montomani, sir, for accepting our invitation out of your busy schedule. I extend my gratitude to our director, Dr. K. Ganesh Babu, sir, for his constant support. As no program can become successful with a single person. So I extend my big thanks to Architect Siddhartha, sir, and Architect Jyoti Kumari, our webinar coordinators, and Architect Arshita, our broadcasting coordinator, for ensuring that the webinar series continues smoothly. I also thank the management of Aditya Group of Institutions for extending their support. I thank all the delegates and esteemed members of the architectural fraternity who joined us today. With this, we conclude today's session. Have a nice weekend. Thank you.